Hello. Today I would like to talk about the invisible people in our society. Invisible, what I mean by that, are the ones who we may be able to visually see them, but they're invisible in that we don't really acknowledge them, speak with them, we don't address their needs or how they feel or if we could help or assist them in any way. They're just invisible. Well, I want to tell you about Joan. Joan's a lady who lives on the street, has lived there for many years. She, let me show you her picture. She's an older lady, and she doesn't look real friendly, but part of that is from the conditions in which she lives in. First of all, she doesn't smile. She's pretty beaten down. She sleeps in fields and against buildings sometimes. And anyway, she decided one day that, she needed to find somewhere where she felt she could belong. And she tells the story of the fact that she decided that that place would be where God would be celebrated. That would be the church, the Christian church. And so she decided to go to church one day. Now Joan pulls behind her a little cart that has her blanket, her pillow, and a plastic bag, her personal belongings. And when you see that in society, you see the homeless pulling things or carrying bags, don't be upset. Just remember that all your possessions are in your home, safe. All their possessions are on them. And that's why they have these things that they carry or they pull. So she always pulls her cart. So anyway, one day she was going to this church, and when she got there, she was pulling her cart. She pulled it to the door, and they had greeters at the door, and the lady said, "Welcome," and handed her a program. Joan says she didn't look up, she didn't smile, she just handed me a program and then looked beyond me to some people she saw and started hollering, "Oh, it's good to see you're coming." And she said she went into the foyer where there were all these greeters talking with people, and she said she could hear, she was eavesdropping, she could hear that they were saying, "It's so good to see you," and "What's your name?" And sometimes she would ask, "Where are you from?" And she would, the greeters would connect to them about certain things in the community. And she said everyone was being, interacted with except I wasn't. And she said I stood there just waiting for someone to maybe help me feel okay about being there. She said, but it didn't come, and so she decided she'd move on into the sanctuary. And when she went inside, she said it was large, and she said she decided to sit in the last row. She said that, it just maybe would make the people feel comfortable if she didn't sit among them, but sat in the back. But she also said she sat there because everyone would see her as they come into the church sanctuary. And she said as she was sitting there, she noticed that the pastor was in the front of the church, and he started coming up the rows, shaking hands and welcoming people. And she said there was laughter and sometimes, hugs, and he was touching everyone. She said she noticed that, shaking their hand, putting his hand on their shoulder, making contact. He would look at him. And she said she was just kind of excited, anticipating that someone would shake her hand and welcome her, and that maybe for a few moments she would feel like she was where she's supposed to be. As he came up the aisle and was getting closer, her anticipation seemed to be pretty great. And he stopped at the gentleman in front of her and had his hand on his shoulder, welcoming him. And when it was done, instead of coming to her, she was the last person he would have came to. She's in the last row. He walked by her. And she was just shocked. She said it felt so much like being invisible. But when he got behind her, he reached over and he touched her left shoulder and said, "Morning," and walked on by. Didn't look her in the eye, didn't ask her name, didn't welcome her. Anyway, that morning she said it was ironic that the church service was on love. And she said it was a good church service. And when it was over, they had this part in the service, she said, where they were asked to stand up and welcome the person on the right and welcome the person on the left. And she said she stood up, but no one came to her. She said she looked over and she said, I could have put my hand out, but she said, I just felt like maybe they didn't want me to touch them. She felt awkward, but no one offered their hand. No one greeted her. She did say one lady, a few rows up, looked back at her and just kind of nodded. And she said that was it. And then they sat down and they took the offering. And she said it was very organized. Ushers went down the aisle and they structurally passed this vessel back and forth between the rows. And when it got to her, the gentleman in front reached around to hand her the vessel, and she said the usher reached across her, grabbed that vessel very, very fast and pulled it away. And she said, I don't know his intentions, but it just felt strange. I felt awkward. And then when the service was over, they all stood up, and she said the noise level just raised in the church with laughter and people hugging each other and saying it was good to see them. And she said you could just hear all this communication going on around about her. She said she couldn't get out because there were so many people in the aisle, but eventually she was able to get to the foyer. And she said the ushers and the greeters were all in there thanking the people for coming. She said she could hear, hope you come back, and people their names being spoken. And she said she stood there for a few minutes, but no one said anything to her. So she said she finally went out the door. Well, it's not that complicated, people. The church is to be the place where people come and feel love, the love of God. In Matthew 25, it says, I was sick and in prison, I was hungry, you didn't come and visit me. The scripture goes on and describes this scenario where, Christ is telling them, you didn't visit me, you didn't see me, you didn't feed me, you didn't clothe me, And then they say, when, Lord? When did we not do that? And he tells them, when you didn't do it to the least of these, my brothers, you didn't do it for me. You did not do it for me. It was as if they didn't do it for the Lord. Well, it's not that complicated. You greet them. You ask them their name. You tell them your name. And you say something like, Joan, we're glad you came. My name's Sarah. If you have any questions, just flag me down. We're so happy you're here. Another thing is yes, they may have come to your church with a hidden agenda, like they're hungry and hoping for a cup of coffee or maybe a donut. But it's not that complicated. You invite them to coffee hour. You invite them to Bible studies. You welcome them and tell them about the services and all the things that the family of the church do and can offer them. You make them feel like they could possibly belong somewhere. And the interesting thing is I feel that so many people, when they see the homeless, they feel like the homeless are just there for a handout, or they're just there to get something from somebody. But I'm here to say that maybe, just maybe, God put them there to help you deal with your fear of them. You ever thought about that? If you don't look in the face of a homeless, you might not be looking in the face of God. If you look, you might see him. Because you need to ask yourself about your own level of compassion. For many years, my husband and I would go out on the street, and we'd do this every week, and we would offer up a little food and sometimes gift cards to restaurant, a little bit of monetary assistance, but not that much. But we learned something. One time I bought these bags of wooden crosses, and as we would go out, of course, I would talk to them about the Lord, and And I would ask them, do you have a prayer request? And if they did, I'd whip my little pad out and I would write it out. And I would say it back to them. And then I would say, I want to give you this cross to remind you that Christ loves you and to remind you that we will be praying for you. And the interesting thing is they were far more excited about that cross than they were about any of the food or the assistance that we had given them. Those crosses became so important. And week after week when we would run into them, they would pull out their cross. They'd have to show us their cross. Some of them even drilled little holes in them and strung them with a string around their neck. Some had them hanging on their carts. But those crosses meant a lot. And sometimes they would say, is there a way I could get another one? They wanted those crosses. The other thing is they always told us about their faith and their belief. Homeless people believe in God because that's who they have to trust. They have no one else. And one person even put it and said, I don't want to be in this society. I don't want possessions or belongings because I'm afraid if I had them, I wouldn't be desperate for my relationship with God because I see so many people, they lose sight of God in all the stuff they own. Very insightful. Very, very insightful. So the important thing is that you indeed may not want to open your eyes, open your heart, and reach out to the homeless. But if you're in church, you greet them. You ask them their name. You tell them your name. You tell them about your church. You make them feel comfortable. You touch them. You do what anyone would do if Christ walked into that church. And you make them feel a part. And I believe that in regards to the carts, it would be nice if the church just had a place that would help them usher their cart to another place in the church and say, we'll secure it here for you until the end. They don't want to be conspicuous, but their life puts them in a situation where they are seen because of how they look, but they're invisible in their needs and in their interactions and in their connectedness. And what role did you play on this? Well, one thing about Ruth, real quickly, I will tell you. A couple of weeks ago, I was in a Bible study, and a gentleman asked, wonder what people feel like if they're homeless when they come into a church. In that Bible study, I didn't think about anything else. Once he said that, my mind was locked on that thought. When it was over, I told my husband, I don't want to wonder. I want to know what it feels like to go to our Christian church. This is me. With makeup, dressed down, pulling a cart, I went to church. I kept my face very, very flat affect on it. And part of the reason is because it's true, when the homeless show up, they're not the cheeriest of people, but excuse them. They slept on a street, in between a building, in a field. That's where they slept. There's circles under their eyes. Their lifestyle doesn't give them a comfortable bed and a structured condition. So they may not be as cheerful as the other members of your congregation. And so when they come, welcome them and make them feel like they belong. And just remember, the important thing is, when you look at the face of a homeless, if you do, you may see Jesus. You may see Jesus. And they're there, maybe not to receive so much from you, as maybe God put them there to help teach you how to deal with your fear. So just think about it. I am going to include a link of the story I wrote about the experience. This is just a quick video. And if you push the link that will be placed in this area that you're looking at this video, it will take you to the story if you're interested in reading more. So I couldn't do this again.